Hey, welcome back to Triple C, Candace's College Cooking, where I have the privilege of teaching you, the 20-something crowd, the basics and hacks of cooking, as well as how to create restaurant-worthy dishes to impress your roommates, your friends, or even a date. Today, we're gonna dive into a super classic, yet super easy, delicious soup, tomato bisque. It's great with a side of garlic bread or even a grilled cheese sandwich. Let me walk you through the ingredients. I've got a bit of a quandary today. I only had 1 can of whole peeled tomatoes, and I only had 3 vine ripe tomatoes. So I'm gonna do a little bit of half and half. Here's what you need to know. The tomatoes in this can are a whole lot smaller than the tomatoes on the board that are fresh. And so we wanna make sure that our ingredients are somewhat of the same size. So here's what we're gonna do. First, let's drain the tomatoes into a bowl, because we're gonna use this later. And you want a foil lined cookie sheet. I know a lot of times I say, you can opt out for the foil. This time you want the foil. Because if the tomatoes stick to the cookie sheet, that is no good from a cleanup perspective. All right, pour our tomatoes onto the cookie sheet. And normally, again, I would use 2 cans of whole peeled tomatoes. You need about 3 pounds of tomatoes for this recipe. So that's the way I normally would do it, but again, didn't have all the stuff I needed, so we're gonna ad hoc. Now, I've washed these tomatoes. And by the way, I like to buy tomatoes that are on the vine. That's the way they're phrased in the grocery store. They just, they're a whole lot fresher than the other tomatoes, and I find just typically have a better taste. Now, what we're gonna do with these tomatoes is we're gonna core them. So that's pretty easy. Let me show you how to do that. Put the tomato, I guess you'd call this vine side down, all right? Cut that in 2, and then we're gonna cut the core out. And you can do that, again, always wanna have a sharp knife, and that's it, all right? We're gonna place this face down on the cookie sheet, and you can see that some of these tomatoes, they look now like they're about the same size. Give me just a couple of seconds, let me finish cutting these tomatoes. I've finished cutting my fresh tomatoes, and now to the roasting pan, the baking sheet, we're gonna add 1 sweet yellow onion sliced latitudinally, and if you need to know what that means, go watch the humble onion episode. Just sprinkle those onions on top of the cookie sheet. Now we're gonna add 3 cloves of smashed garlic. Now this isn't completely chopped. You whack it with your knife, you peel it, and then you whack it again, and that's pretty much what it looks like. So we're gonna just sprinkle the garlic, on top of the cookie sheet. Let me give you a quick little tip on garlic. So I use fresh garlic almost exclusively, but sometimes in a pinch, I would like to use jarred garlic. Let me show you these 2 pieces of garlic. These are heads of garlic. The one with the purple is gonna be the best. It's the sweetest, it's fabulous, and it costs the same as the white. So if you're in the grocery store and you see some purpley garlic, grab that because it's fantastic. All right, now jarred garlic. You can get jarred garlic. I would not use jarred garlic in this recipe because we're going to roast the tomatoes and the onions and the garlic under the broiler in the oven. But in a pinch, if you're making a soup or you're making a dish and it starts with saute the vegetables in a pan, you can certainly use jarred garlic in a pinch. Let's move on to the herbs. Today, specifically, I'm going to use fresh herbs because I have them right outside my kitchen door. I know you're in school, you probably don't have a patio, but if you had a balcony, you can certainly buy some basil, fresh basil. They sell it in the grocery store, I think, for $5 for a plant. Put it in a nice little pot and stick it out on your balcony. You can do the same thing with thyme if you want to. Now, this recipe calls for fresh thyme, and I wanted to show you what this looks like and show you how to deal with it. Because unlike parsley and cilantro, you actually are going to not use the stems of the thyme. Here's how you take the thyme off of the stem. You turn it upside down, and you use your fingers and drag the thyme off of the stem. Now, if you have really fresh or young thyme, the stem is not gonna be very woody, and it is edible, so you're okay to use that. But where it's not, where it's kind of, you can see how kind of rough this is, you don't wanna eat that. So again, you just move, you go in the opposite direction of the way the thyme leaves are growing. Now, give me just a couple of seconds. I'm gonna finish getting this thyme off of the stem. Okay, so I finished taking the fresh thyme leaves off the thyme stem, and this is what you're left with. You can see you really don't even need to chop that. This recipe specifically calls for a tablespoon of fresh thyme or a teaspoon of dried thyme. So your dried herb is going to be a lot more potent, and that's why you use a smaller quantity. But again, in this case, we're going to use roughly a tablespoon of fresh thyme, and that's 3 teaspoons, by the way. 1 tablespoon equals 3 teaspoons. So I'm just going to put that thyme over the top. And now we'll move on to the basil. So I've got these fresh basil leaves that I took off of my basil plant that's right outside the kitchen. And what you can do with this is you can chop it. You can make what's called a chiffonade, which is where you roll. You can see you can roll these leaves together and chop them that way. And that makes what's called a chiffonade. And it's easier to cut that way. All right, so we have those herbs. We're gonna sprinkle the basil, fresh basil over the top. And again, if you were using dried basil, you want a teaspoon. The fresh basil, you want a tablespoon of fresh basil. All right, now we're gonna throw in a little bit of salt and pepper. We're gonna use a teaspoon of salt and 1/4 teaspoon of black pepper. And if you like more pepper, certainly feel free to use some. All right, now what we've got to do is we've got to add grease to this pan. So we're going to give it a squirt of about a tablespoon of olive oil. And we're going to give it dollop, technical term, a dollop of 6 tablespoons of butter. Now cut this into tablespoon slices and then cut it again so you have smaller dollops, if you will. So we're going to put 6 of the dollops of butter, and you can certainly break it up. No big deal. It's easier to do this when it's kind of cold, as opposed to it when it's at room temperature. It's going to kind of stick to your fingers. All right, and this is sticking to my fingers a little bit, but I think we'll survive. All right. Okay, so I finished dolloping the butter on top of my cookie sheet that has the tomatoes, the onions, the garlic, the herbs, salt and pepper, a tablespoon of olive oil, and 6 tablespoons of butter. Now I'm gonna put this under the broiler on the top shelf, and we're gonna go for anywhere between 6 to 10 minutes. I'll be back in a few. Okay, while our tomatoes, onions, garlic, herbs, butter, and olive oil are in the broiler, we are going to make a quick roux. Now, a roux is just a mixture of grease and flour. For this one, we're gonna use 2 tablespoons of butter, and you go ahead and you're gonna make this in the pan that you're gonna cook your soup in. I'm gonna use about a tablespoon of olive oil. Let the butter melt and those fats kind of come together, and then we're going to add 1/4 cup of all-purpose flour. Okay, so my oil is hot, my butter is melted. Now I'm gonna add 1/4 cup of all-purpose flour, and you're gonna wanna use a whisk if you have one. If you don't have a whisk, you can certainly use a wooden spoon, but a whisk certainly works the best. Now, unlike if we're cooking a gumbo, we wanna get our roux nice and dark. A blonde roux for this is perfectly fine and is what we want. So it's that quick, my friends, for that roux to come together. All right, to the roux, I'm gonna add the juice from the can of tomatoes. And just give that a good stir. And then we're just gonna shut the heat off for now until our tomatoes are done broiling. Okay, so our tomatoes are out of the oven. We had them on broil for about 10 minutes, and you can see they're a little crispy on the edges. The onions got a little crispy. Now what we're gonna do is I would normally put this in a food processor or use what's called a hand blender, but I doubt that you guys have one of those, but I know what you probably do have. You probably have a blender, because what college kid doesn't love to have frozen drinks? Of course, disclaimer, with or without alcohol, but they're still delicious on a hot summer day. So we're gonna go ahead and use the blender to mix up and pulverize, puree, if you will, our tomatoes, onions, garlic, and herbs. So to get all this delicious goodness into the blender, I'm going to use an interesting spoon that you use when you're frying something, but that'll keep the liquid, get our solids and leave the liquid in our baking sheet. Okay. So let's get our tomatoes into the blender, and we might end up needing to do this in a couple of batches. In fact, I'm going to say let's do it in a couple of batches. Now, the other thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add a teaspoon of baking soda. The tomatoes are super acidic, and so you can either use sugar, you can use a tablespoon of sugar, or you can use a teaspoon of baking soda, and I'm gonna use a teaspoon of baking soda. And I'm just gonna go ahead and put that in the blender because that'll make sure it gets pureed up well. We'll give this a 1, 2, 3. All right, and we'll add that tomato mixture into our roux. And now we'll repeat it for the rest of the tomatoes. Okay, so I got all of the tomatoes, onions, and garlic and herbs pureed up. I've got them in the pot with my roux. Now I've got a little bit of leftover olive oil and butter that's melted that's in this pan, and we don't want to let any of that go to waste. So we're gonna pour that into the pan. Okay, now we're going to turn the heat back on, and we're gonna add 4 cups of chicken broth. And remember from our rotisserie chicken episode, you may have some chicken broth ready and available. You can certainly use that or opt for the store-bought type. Give this a stir. Let's bring it to a boil, and then we're gonna simmer it for about 5 minutes. Be back in 5. So our soup came to a boil and has been simmering for 5 minutes. Now, last but not least, this is an optional ingredient, but something that I always love. We're gonna add a cup of heavy cream. Again, if you wanna make this vegetarian, don't worry, you don't have to add the cream, but I like the creamy consistency. So in with a cup of cream and give that a stir. And now we want to check the consistency. So if you want your soup to be a little thicker, add some tomato paste. Probably, I would say on the tomato paste, probably a teaspoon of tomato paste at a time to get it to be the consistency you like. If you find that your soup is too thick, feel free to add a little more broth. And you can probably add that in about 1/4 cup to 1/2 cup at a time. Okay, before we plate this up, let's just give it a little taste for flavor. Heck, that's pretty amazing. So here's how we're gonna plate it up. Soup bowl. I've got some store-bought croutons in the bottom of the bowl. We will put a ladle of soup on top of those croutons. And then I'm gonna give it a little bit of Parmesan cheese, grated Parmesan on top. A little drizzle of olive oil. And then a little fresh basil to make it beautiful. And there you have it, my friends. A beautiful tomato bisque soup. And let me tell you, this thing is head and shoulders above a can of Campbell's tomato soup, with just a little bit more effort. If you found this episode informative, please subscribe to my channel, like this episode, and share on social. Thank you for watching Triple C, and remember, to share a meal is to share a life. I hope you have a fantastic day.